On the 4th of September 1986, an independent company was formed that would change the face of global video gaming. Starting out from humble beginnings, this company would go on to create one of the best-selling video game franchises of all time, innovating with technology and dazzling audiences with cutting-edge graphics, compelling characters, and gripping narratives. The name of that company was Square. But what was it that made Square so special? And how did this company, which was founded by Masafumi Miyamoto, an entrepreneur who had no real idea about programming, manage to create video games that would appeal to so many people in so many countries around the world? Well, we're about to find out, as in the first part of our marvelously comprehensive documentary series that was created thanks to the support of our Patreon community. We will focus on the formation of the company, how individuals who would become key figures at Square would find themselves working there in the first place, and in our rather granular fashion, we will explore a significant number of events that laid the foundation for their push for independence. Welcome to part 1 of the complete history of Square. The roots of Square can be found in Tokushima City. Situated within Tokushima, one of the 4 prefectures of the Shikoku region, Tokushima City has a fascinating history. Its famed castle was built in 1586, and in 1889, when the municipal system was enforced, its population was the 10th largest in Japan. Everything hinted at continued prosperity, but that all changed on the 4th of July, 1945. With the United States of America on the offensive as World War II began to reach its conclusion, Tokushima was identified as a strategic target by the 21st Bomber Command. They felt the city should be neutralized due to its role as an agricultural center for the region, and when the bombers returned from their mission, large portions of Tokushima City had been leveled by incendiary bombs. With much of the city in ruins and thousands upon thousands of households affected, a huge restoration project was undertaken after the war to try and help the city recover from this devastating blow. As the years passed, the recovery effort was seeing results. Tokushima City was granted the designation of being a new industrial city by the Japanese government, and many were keen to take advantage of this prosperous wave of change. It saw numerous companies formed across a wide variety of emerging industries, and one such company was the Denusha Electric Power Company, with Den meaning electricity and U meaning friend. This company was established in April of 1963 by a young man named Kuniichi Miyamoto to assist with the creation and installation of power lines in and around Tokushima City, as well as to provide maintenance for large-scale electrical towers. After seeing modest financial returns in its early years, Denusha managed to secure contracts with the likes of the Shikoku Electric Power Company, and after 10 years in business, these contracts have been leveraged to turn Denusha into an important customer of Shikoku Bank, as the company's capital had quadrupled and its earnings had increased in a significant manner. The success of Denusha afforded the Miyamoto family a comfortable life, and one of the people who benefited most was Kuniichi's son, Masafumi, who had been born on the 18th of March 1957. Owing to his father's success, Masafumi Miyamoto was given every opportunity to succeed, and one of the most prominent areas where this was evidenced was with education. After scouting out numerous schools, it was decided that Miyamoto would transfer from a local school in Tokushima to a private school called Nada Junior and Senior High School, which was based far away in Kobe City, which resided in the Kansai region. Nada High School was notorious for its severe entrance examinations, but its impressive academic records meant that families from all over Japan were fighting for places for their children. The school also featured a holistic curriculum that, due to Jigoro Kano, the father of judo himself, being one of the founding members, insisted on students undertaking a concentrated judo program. Such was the quality of teaching at Nada High School that numerous alumni went on to achieve big things after leaving, and even when isolating alumni to those who were in the same school year as Miyamoto, this still includes the likes of Tsukasa Uemura, the current ambassador of Japan in Saudi Arabia, Hideki Morimoto, the former vice minister in the Ministry of Environment, and Kiyotaka Fujii, the former president and CEO of SAP Japan and Louis Vuitton Japan. After being exposed to this high-achieving environment, Miyamoto prospered. He was able to attain very strong academic results, and this allowed him to be accepted into the prestigious Waseda University in Tokyo. Here, Miyamoto studied alongside some of the finest minds in the country, and while doing so, he dreamt of the future and all the things he could accomplish as an entrepreneur after graduating, such as creating a company that focused on manufacturing women's clothing. But as graduation loomed, for one reason or another, those dreams struggled to become a reality, and Miyamoto became resigned to the requirement that he would need to join Denusha and work for his father in the electric power business. It was not the ideal scenario, and Miyamoto resolved to use his entrepreneurial mind to try and think of ways to branch out and make a name for himself, as if he couldn't make inroads into the fashion industry right now, he would need to try and leverage his father's company so that one day his aspirations may still come true. Around that time, home computers were a very new piece of technology, but thanks to advances made by companies such as Commodore, Apple and Atari, the home computer was starting to gain popularity in certain niches, and more companies sought to take advantage. By 1980, Japanese companies had entered the race alongside other newcomers, and this increasing competition led to significant technological advances, as well as new programs that were created to try and take advantage of the upgraded hardware capabilities. These programs came in all forms, but owing to humanity's need to play, video games were emerging as one of the more intriguing prospects. Thanks to hits like Space Invaders, Galaxian and Pac-Man, the financial returns available to those who produced high-quality video games were clear. But those returns had been primarily driven by the success of arcade machines, and solutions that would allow people to game at home were only just starting to be explored. Two solutions rose above the rest. First, there was the home console. This could be connected to a television set, and, as it allowed parents to recreate the ever-popular arcade scene at home, it was marketed at children. Then, there was the personal computer. Serving as a much more sophisticated piece of equipment, personal computers were aimed at a more mature audience, as outside of being able to play games, they could also be used to run more practical pieces of software. Based on these trends, Miyamoto believed that video games would only increase in popularity as different hardware manufacturers were in a constant fight to create systems that were more affordable, faster and more readily available than their competition. And it was with that belief in mind that Miyamoto resolved to start up a video game development company so that he could take advantage and reap the financial rewards. But there was a problem. For all his education, Miyamoto knew very little about software development, and as he had no interest in learning how to code, create digital art, compose music or write a script, he had to come up with a creative solution that would allow him to be able to produce video games that consumers would be interested in purchasing. The plan was simple. If Miyamoto could not produce video games himself, then he would need to find people who could help. And this was where Miyamoto's philosophy differed from many of the other companies and individuals who were producing games at the same time. It was not uncommon for the production of a game like Space Invaders to be done by just one person. In this case, it was Tomohiro Nishikado who came up with the concept, did all the game design and the programming, but he also came up with the loose scenario, the concept and in-game artwork, created the sound effects, and even engineered the game's arcade hardware by putting together a microcomputer from scratch. Miyamoto realized that this was not sustainable or scalable. People who were multi-talented were a rare commodity, and even though they could do it all, they were unlikely to be the best in each of those fields, and as video games became more complicated, those deficiencies would be highlighted. It made more sense to try and find individuals who showed talents in each specific area and have them work together to make a product that was much more than the sum of its parts. But he needed a way to find those individuals, and so he hatched a plan. Personal computers were still quite sought after, and it was rare that students would have access to their own. Often they would need to spend time in university computer labs, but not everyone wanted to spend time in that particular environment. Miyamoto felt that if he could provide another location where students could congregate and have access to a personal computer, they would want to hang out, network, and if everything went according to plan, want to build something together. After speaking with his father about some of these ambitions, a subdivision of Danyusha was created to try and help him achieve them. The initial step was to rent a suitable location, and after studying the landscape, Miyamoto found what he no doubt believed to be the ideal spot. Due to its focus on technology, students from Keio University were established as the prime clientele, and at some point between 1981 and 1982, Miyamoto managed to secure a place right next to Keio University's Hiyoshi campus. Today, that location is occupied by a mod's hair salon, but back then, it was home to dozens of state-of-the-art computers. These were made available for people to use for an hourly rental fee, serving as something of a precursor to internet cafes. Just as had been hoped, Miyamoto's computer rental business started to attract students from not just Keio University, but neighbouring universities as well, and 3 such students, named Hisashi Suzuki, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and Hiromichi Tanaka, would have a profound impact on the future of the company. Suzuki was enrolled at Keio University's Department of Economics, and much like Miyamoto, came from an affluent background. Prior to attending Keio University, this saw Suzuki study at Goyo Gakuin High School, an exclusive private school that was only 8 kilometers away from Nada High School. Keen to earn some money and gain some practical business experience, in 1981 Suzuki managed to land a part-time position at a company called Koei, where he would assist with sales. And this ended up being an invaluable position, as Koei were in a constant state of flux. Having seen the family business go bankrupt, Yoichi Elikawa revived Koei with his wife Keiko, but it wasn't plain sailing. In their first year of business, the pair attempted to do what was expected of them. They continued selling clothing dye, much as the previous incarnation of the company had done under the management of Yoichi's father, but things weren't going so well, and as Yoichi had no real interest in the business, he became quite demoralized. To try and lift Yoichi's spirits, Keiko surprised her husband with a brand new Sharp MZ computer. It turned out to be the perfect gift. Yoichi was rejuvenated, having found a new passion, video games, and this passion gave him the confidence to take a huge risk, abandoning the family trade and turning Koei into a video game developer. Koei launched their first game, Battle of Kawanakajima, in October of 1981 and followed it up by releasing Nightlife, a game that is believed to be the first commercially produced erotic computer game. But it wasn't until 1983 that they would have their first blockbuster title, and it was called Nobunaga's Ambition. Suzuki assisted with the launch of this title, but decided to leave Koei soon after in order to join Danyusha. But even though Suzuki had come on board to help, despite being so close to Keio University, Miyamoto's computer rental business had struggled to attract any real attention from its student body. Instead, owing to its proximity to Hiyoshi Station, the main clientele ended up being students from Kanagawa University's Yokohama campus and Yokohama National University. Miyamoto had also been disappointed at the lack of solid candidates who could help him create video games, so he decided to bide his time and continue attempting to make the rental business as profitable as possible. To assist, he posted a classified advert in a magazine for the position of clerk, and one of the individuals who applied was a young man named Hironobu Sakaguchi. Born on the 25th of November 1962 in the city of Hitachi, Sakaguchi had dreamt of becoming a musician throughout much of his youth. But realizing that it was perhaps not the most stable of professions, he instead decided to study electronics and information engineering at Yokohama National University. It was here that Sakaguchi became exposed to computers, and a love affair began with video games, specifically Western adventure games that had been released on the Apple II, like Wizardry and Ultima. Desperate to play the latest releases, but lacking the means to do so, Sakaguchi sought a part-time job so that he could make his own Apple II by purchasing bootlegged parts from Akihabara. The dream would have been to land a part-time position at a pioneering video game company like Namco or Konami, where he would get to make games for a living. But as they were arcade specialists, Sakaguchi knew his lack of experience would make it impossible for that dream to become a reality, and so he ended up applying for the role at Denusha. It didn't take long for Miyamoto and Suzuki to realize that in Sakaguchi, they had found just what they were looking for in order to pursue their actual goal of making video games, but they knew they would need more help, and it just so happened that Sakaguchi had a close friend who was also a member of the Faculty of Engineering at Yokohama National University. His name was Hiromichi Tanaka. Tanaka was born in Ichikawa City, but by the time he'd entered primary school, his family had already moved to Mitaka City and then to Katsushika City. It was around this time that he developed a keen interest in science fiction, having been sucked into the worlds of Ultraman, Ultra Q and Astro Boy, and much like Sakaguchi, this led to an interest in building his own Apple II so that he could play the latest video games. Tanaka did well in school and had dreams of attending the Tokyo Institute of Technology or Waseda University, but his family was too poor, and so he attended Yokohama National University instead. But after arriving there, Tanaka found the degree he'd chosen wasn't quite what he expected. Most of his knowledge with technology was useless, as the courses related more to conceptual applications. Sakaguchi, who was a classmate, was also struggling, as his mind was elsewhere, and the pair became friends after identifying each other as oddballs who weren't quite as invested in their electrical engineering studies as some of the other students. But Tanaka had picked up some useful skills along the way, and this helped him to secure a role as a programmer at Denusha, despite knowing no more about programming than Sakaguchi. With this small team assembled, Miyamoto believed that they now had the skills to be able to work on the next phase of his plan, and in late 1983, Denusha Square was formed as a formal subdivision of Denusha. This subdivision was named by Miyamoto, but the inspiration came from an unusual source that was quite far removed from the corporate byline that's pushed out today. Instead of being named Square because they wanted to be a company that would square up to problems instead of shying away from them, or because Square represents the typical shape of a room where creators come together to solve problems, Miyamoto named the company as such because he was a keen golfer and enjoyed using the square grip. But as he was so embarrassed about this origin story, Miyamoto requested that Sakaguchi come up with something more creative for the company newsletter. With the core team assembled and the subdivision formed, Miyamoto instructed everyone to start working on their first video game. It would have been a very exciting prospect for all involved, but perhaps due to their collective inexperience, the decision was taken to have the video game be based on an existing property as opposed to something much more original. And after what was no doubt a lot of deliberating, the Birdman Rally was selected as that existing property. This was an event that had been growing in popularity after it had first aired on Japanese TV in 1977, and the team no doubt felt its concept, which saw contestants attempt to fly the furthest on their human-powered flying machines, would work well as an interesting video game. Square did not have permission to make a video game based on this property, but Miyamoto did not see this as being an issue. He felt they would be able to sell their game to the broadcasting company once it was complete, and the team agreed with this sentiment, at least in the initial sense. True to the wider vision, Miyamoto hired numerous individuals who would focus on graphics and writing. They also hired a main programmer, Hironobu Kato, a high schooler who often rode a large motorbike and stopped by the cafe to spend time on the computers. Tanaka, as he was at least somewhat competent at programming, would then assist Kato, and Sakaguchi was installed as the planner, helping to coordinate efforts and ensure everyone was pulling in the same direction. And this was a crucial role, as at one point there were nearly 20 people working on the game. But even though this was all very exciting, as many of them were able to fulfill their dream of working on a video game, there was also a notion of exploitation based on that excitement. Sakaguchi, who had been employed on a part-time basis as a clerk, had seen his contract changed from hourly to piece rate when the project commenced, and many of the other developers had been brought on board based on similar deals. It meant they would only be paid upon completion of the project, but as they were creating a game based on something to which they did not hold the rights, if the pitch was rejected, there was a fear that nobody would receive any financial compensation for all the time they'd spent working on the game. That fear was then realized. One day, Sakaguchi arrived at the office and saw nobody there. The pitch had been rejected by the owner of the IP, and it meant the project was cancelled. It led to a lot of frustration over how much time had been wasted, but many of the development staff, including Sakaguchi and Tanaka, decided to be pragmatic. Yes, their original plan had been shot down, but they had still gained a lot of knowledge and created a lot of useful assets that could be salvaged, and it was this pragmatism that led to the creation of what would become known as the Death Trap. Deviating away from the Birdman Rally Championship, Sakaguchi sought to create a text-based adventure game. It was a genre that had been the focus of PC development in Western markets for some time, but it wasn't until the early 1980s, following the release of games such as the Portopia serial murder case, which was developed by none other than Yuji Horii, that its popularity began to see a significant rise in Japan. Determined to take advantage of this increase in popularity, the team made up for their lack of practical experience by showing a relentless drive to create something and put it out into the world. Sakaguchi was central to this, and owing to his nature as a bit of a taskmaster, he gained the nickname of Goblin. But it was through these efforts, which saw Sakaguchi coordinating the team and contributing where it made sense, that the Death Trap started to take shape. They also made progress because they stayed true to Miyamoto's original vision. Specialists were pulled in to help where possible, and meant that even though Sakaguchi did write the final story, 6 other writers had also contributed. 3 part-time graphic designers were also brought on board to create visual assets, and this was important, as during that time, very few text-based adventures featured visuals, and there was a belief that innovating in this manner would help the Death Trap to stand out in what was a rather saturated market. The team also innovated by placing a focus on accessibility, and they did this by making it possible for users to input their actions in Japanese as well as English, something that was very uncommon. When the Death Trap was released in October of 1984 on the PC-88 and PC-98, the team felt a huge degree of satisfaction. They had shipped a product that could be found on store shelves. But despite partnering with a company called ASCII to help with distribution, the Death Trap was met with minimal fanfare, and it's believed to have only sold 3,000 copies. Far from being a runaway success, the Death Trap had at least proved to be a solid start, and owing to its high price point, had generated approximately 30 million yen in revenue, around $120,000 based on exchange rates at the time. Buoyed by its success, the team started working on 2 new games, and they did so with the objective of making them much bigger commercial hits. One would be a text-based adventure that would act as the sequel to The Death Trap, and the other would be a multiplayer train simulator set in America called Amtrak. Around the same time that Square were finding their feet, 3 other video game companies realized the spirit of cooperation would allow them to grow faster in what was becoming a hyper-competitive space. It saw Hummingbird Soft, Thinking Rabbit, and Crystal Soft create the Trinity Software Group, and they did so with the aim of supporting each other's efforts by knowledge sharing and providing services that the others might have lacked. Other developers took note, and throughout the first half of 1985, Square, alongside the likes of Falcom and Game Arts, joined the initiative. With such a significant increase in membership, the Trinity Software Group was renamed, becoming the Super Software Team, or SST for short, and after being bolstered by this new union, Square sought to increase their ambition. The original plan was to release 2 games throughout 1985, but when Square announced their revised plans to the general public by taking out an advert in a magazine, they not only showed their plans to release 4 games in the second half of 1985, with the release of another in the start of 1986, but they even offered a proposed timeline. The first release was planned for July of 1985, and it would see Square support Game Arts, a fellow member of the SST. Game Arts had released their debut game called Thexter earlier that year on the PC-88. It saw players control a fighting robot that could transform into a jet, and upon its release, it had been a smash hit, selling hundreds of thousands of copies. Wanting to expand the game's reach even further, Game Arts licensed Thexter to Square so that they could publish a port on the Sharp X1. In the same month, Square had planned to release their next original property, Will, the Death Trap 2. This would again be supervised by Hironobu Sakaguchi, who is now in charge of Square's A-Team, and it would feature an expanded scope. A month later, Square would again show their support for a fellow SST member. This time, they would assist Nihon Falcom by helping to publish Dragon Slayer, one of Japan's first action RPGs that have released in 1984 on 2 new platforms, the PC-98 and MSX. The final property would then be a game called Genesis. This would be supervised by Hiromichi Tanaka, who is now in charge of Square's B team, and it would be an RPG as opposed to an adventure game. Assuming all went to plan, this monster year would then be followed up with a big splash in 1986 as Square teased the release of a brand new property called Cruise Chaser Blasty. After announcing their plans, Square decided to hire more people to ensure they could deliver on what had been promised, but after realizing they could no longer rely on the computer cafe and small job listings to find the appropriate staff, advertising campaigns were run in more professional magazines where Square literally showed the proposed office setup to try and entice people to join the company. One of the key hires made through this process was Shun Saigusa. A postgraduate student from Koei University's Hiyoshi campus, Saigusa was the dream hire for Miyamoto, and his main task would be to work with Hironobu Kato, who had been the main programmer on the Death Trap, to try and figure out how they could push even more boundaries with this new game, and what they ended up creating was rather progressive. The original game had introduced imagery alongside the text-based adventure, and this had helped to enrich the experience, but the team wanted to push this further. A small team of artists were again employed, and they were responsible for creating a new array of full-colour drawings using pixels that were much more vibrant. Using graphics in this way was often quite a resource-heavy function, and Saigusa was responsible for figuring out how to have these rendered in an efficient manner without there being degradation elsewhere. But Saigusa also had another responsibility. Even though video games such as Dragon's Lair and Punch-Out had featured complex animations, they used a combination of pre-rendered scenes, polygons and sprites, and it meant that the use of animations was either very resource-heavy or rather simplistic. As such, animation was unheard of in games that had a heavy reliance on full rendered imagery, and in order to create an interactive experience, adventure games would often use static imagery to complement the use of a command-based input system. Square had an ambition to change that, and thanks to the work done by Saigusa, they were able to create what is believed to be Japan's first animated PC game, and they did so using bitmap imagery. Sakaguchi was responsible for overseeing this innovation, and outside of working as the director, coordinating efforts and extolling the wider vision, he also worked on creating the music and monster designs, fulfilled Tanaka's previous programming role, helped the team create some full-color drawings, and even, based on what he had learned from working on the scenario of the original game, took greater responsibility for the scenario of Will. It was a mammoth effort, but Sakaguchi was driven to keep working, pushing himself and the team to create something that was much better than their first game. As the team toiled away, Miyamoto and Suzuki put their effort into positioning Square as a more affluent and established brand, and one of the biggest areas of focus was product packaging. Unlike their original game, which had box art based on a photo Sakaguchi had taken from his desk, every new game released by Square would now be part of what was known as the Squaresoft library. And to help consumers identify their games outside of seeing the logo, each new release would go to market in a pristine white package with a consistent typeface and gold lettering. When Will the Death Trap 2 launched in July of 1985, it was given the number 2 designation within the Squaresoft library, and the Japanese public were impressed. Over 100,000 copies were sold, and by selling at a retail price of 5,800 yen, Square were able to generate approximately 600 million yen in revenue. Later that month, Square published the planned ports of Dragon Slayer and Thexter. They were released as entries number 4 and number 5 into the Squaresoft library, but entry number 3 would never see a public release, as development of Amtrak was cancelled so close to launch that Square did not even have time to update the packaging of the other games. Nonetheless, thanks to the success of Will, Dragon Slayer and Thexter, Square's position as a company of note within the video games industry was solidified, and they had again shown that Miyamoto's plan of combining the strengths of talented individuals instead of relying on the talent of a selected few had real merit. With 4 releases now under their belt, Square looked to the future. And after signing a deal with a company that was making waves within the video game industry, that future would be impacted in both the immediate sense, but also for many years to come. Because that company was Nintendo. Nintendo had started out as a manufacturer of Hanafuda, but throughout the 20th century, after realizing the limitation of producing playing cards, they started to transition into more lucrative ventures. By the late 1960s, Nintendo, having identified and put their faith in the unorthodox talents of Gunpei Yokoi, had produced a string of hit toys, This included the Ultra Hand and the Love Tester, and in 1970 they released the Nintendo Beam Gun, which would be their initial step into the video games industry. In the decade that followed, Nintendo learned from hardware companies such as Magnavox and started to create their own arcade games such as Donkey Kong. And in July of 1983, they released their very own home console, called the Family Computer, or Famicom for short, as a direct competitor to arcade systems. It was a smart move, as the arcade scene, despite the video game crash of 1983, was still the largest sector in the global video games industry. But even though developing games for a younger audience could be lucrative, there were plenty of developers like Square who preferred to target an older audience with much more thought-provoking games that didn't offer that instant dopamine hit. From day one, the creators at Square had the objective of being at the cutting edge of technology, and they felt the audience who would most appreciate their approach would be young adults. This meant developing games for PCs, but by 1985, it became hard for them to ignore how successful the Famicom was becoming. Having launched to limited fanfare due to numerous hardware issues, by 1985, the Famicom had managed to sell 6.5 million units in Japan. This meant an estimated 20% of Japanese households had purchased the console, and it proved that with its custom graphics processor, which allowed video game developers to make ever complex games, the Famicom was more than just a toy marketed at kids. It was a viable competitor to personal computers and was stealing market share as opposed to coexisting. Faced with this reality, the leadership team at Square decided to be pragmatic, and in spite of the majority of their staff being unwilling to develop games for the Famicom, they held initial meetings with Nintendo. After they concluded, on the 24th of June 1985, Square reportedly became the 7th third-party developer to sign a deal to produce games for the Nintendo, following the likes of Namco, Konami, and Bandai. But a few weeks after they signed the deal, Will then released as a commercial success, and as Square had already spoken to the public about their development roadmap for 1985, it created quite the dilemma. Due to this new agreement, Square would need to produce games for the Famicom, but the success of Will now meant that Famicom development represented the risk as opposed to the opportunity, and continued development on personal computers was the smart business choice as they could build on the success of Will. It led to some tough decisions, and although we don't know the truth about what happened, it seems plausible that instead of releasing Genesis as planned in December 1985, Square chose to release a Famicom port of the ever-popular Thexter. Around the same time, Square also chose to start experimenting with their development efforts on PC. Hiromichi Tanaka, who had been directing Genesis, led a small team to develop a game called 3156 Kolo Kolo, and this was entered into Login Magazine's game development contest. Shigehiko Sasaki, a new hire, also worked on what would be dubbed as the Square Music Editor. This was published in December of 1985 alongside the Famicom port of Thexter, and it would allow composers to work with the music macro language that was used for sequencing music within computer games. Each of these actions served as evidence for how serious Square was about becoming a major player within the video games industry, and they laid a solid foundation for what would become a major push for independence from its parent company, Denusha. By late 1985, even though the amount of consistent employees on the books at Square had been increasing, almost everyone outside of Miyamoto himself, no matter how many hours they worked, was on either a piece rate or part-time contract. But following the success of Will and the decent returns seen from their ports of Thexter and Dragon Slayer, revenue was strong, and it no doubt strengthened their belief that they were pushing in the right direction, and that their third original game would showcase just how ambitious they were. Cruise Chaser Blasty had been announced midway through 1985, but even though it wasn't planned to release until the following year, it was given a full-page spread. It served as a statement of intent. After finishing up on Will, Hironobu Sakaguchi was again assigned as the director, but unlike the two previous projects, which were developed using internal resources and were small in scope and scale, Cruise Chaser Blasty would see Square working with a well-known third party, and Sakaguchi would be exploring a brand new genre. Having been obsessed with the Apple II, Sakaguchi was very familiar with a game known as Wizardry. Developed by Surtech, an American studio founded by Andrew Greenberg and Robert Woodhead, Wizardry released in 1981 as one of the first role-playing games that was based on Dungeons & Dragons. but it was also innovative in other ways, through its expressive use of colour and by allowing the player to control a party as opposed to just a single protagonist. Wizardry had a profound impact on Sakaguchi and served as a direct influence for the design of Cruise Chaser Blasty, which instead of being a text-based adventure game, would be a 3D dungeon crawler that featured role-playing elements. To assist, Square would again use a collection of freelance graphic artists, and 2 new programmers were hired to work alongside Shun Saigusa, who was responsible for system programming. They also hired Kazuhiko Aoki, who would work with Sakaguchi on the game's general design and scenario. But steps were also taken to amplify other aspects, and this saw Square make purposeful strides into the realm of audio-visual. Realizing it would be difficult to find the kind of specialism they needed from young freelancers, Square decided it would be best to try and partner with an established name in the industry. They believed this would help the game stand out much more than either of their 2 previous games could, and it was rumoured that Square had many potential candidates in mind. The list contains the likes of Buichi Terasawa, who had created numerous serialized manga for Weekly Shonen Jump, Yasuhiko Yoshikazu, who had worked as a character designer on Mobile Suit Gundam, and Hayao Miyazaki, who at the time was working with a Japanese animation studio called TMS Entertainment. Unfortunately, it's believed that all 3 declined as they were too busy, but Square did manage to enter into an agreement with Yoshikazu's employer, a respected animation house called Nippon Sunrise, who had made a name for themselves after creating Mobile Suit Gundam and working on other properties like Inspector Gadget. Alongside an increase in visuals, it was also decided that Cruise Chaser Blasty should feature enhanced audio production, and it led to the hiring of 2 composers, Takashi Uno and Nobuo Uematsu, who at the time was a struggling musician who was desperate for work. Uematsu had been relentless in pursuit of becoming a composer and had been producing and sending out demo tapes to anyone who would listen. For a long time, nobody replied, but consistency paid off as work started to come in. At first, this saw Uematsu composing jingles for local commercials and even for Nikatsu Roman porno productions, but when he heard from a friend who just happened to work at Square as an artist that the company were looking for someone to try and compose music for an upcoming game, he jumped at the chance. As development on Cruise Chaser Blasty continued, Square decided to up the ante and committed time and resources into marketing the game to the Japanese public. They knew that owing to their collaboration with Nippon Sunrise, there would be a lot of interest, and they wanted to make people aware that a game existed where players could not only control huge mechanized robots, but fight against others, develop them through a progression system, and do so with cutting-edge visuals, animation, and audio. Such was the scale of these marketing efforts that an original video animation was planned, and a serialized version of the story was set to be released in Hobby Japan just after launch. Action figures were even produced, and Square also allowed the media into their studio so that they could get behind the scenes footage of the creators at work. Their efforts also extended to the finished product packaging, as alongside the game, consumers who purchased Blasty would receive an art book containing gorgeous concepts, as well as what's believed to be their first ever soundtrack, a flexi-disc vinyl containing the main theme. When the game launched in April of 1986, even though it didn't create quite as big a splash as Square had no doubt hoped, all of their efforts did at least cement their position as a prominent video game developer, and it helped to justify some of the business decisions Miyamoto had made just before the game's launch. It saw Sakaguchi and Suzuki given full-time contracts as a thank you for their contribution to the company's success, and as there was no longer a need to try and lure local students through to their computer cafe, the office was moved from Hiyoshi to Ginza. This was an upscale shopping district in Tokyo that today is considered to be one of the most expensive, elegant, and luxurious streets in the world, and by hiring out office space in the newly constructed state-of-the-art Matsumoto building, it showed that Square was becoming a force to be reckoned with. After settling into their new office and seeing the response to Cruise Chaser Blasty, Square continued to plan for their ever-expanding future, and central to this were the staff. Many of the people working at Square were living the dream, and as they were desperate to continue the upward momentum, a strong sense of community started to develop. Everyone just mucked in to help everyone else, and it led to quite a few individuals undergoing a reassessment of their priorities. Now focusing on Square full-time, Hironobu Sakaguchi chose to defer his university studies, but perhaps fearing that someday the dream would end, Sakaguchi chose to stay enrolled at Yokohama National University and continued paying his tuition fees. Hiromichi Tanaka, on the other hand, took quite a different route. After choosing to focus more and more on his work at Square, Tanaka chose to be selective about when he attended university. He did still attend specialist classes and did well in them, but general education classes were deemed unimportant, and he ended up failing so many of those classes that he didn't even have enough credits to graduate. Nonetheless, after displaying significant aptitude, Tanaka still received job offers from big software companies, and his professor arranged it so that if Tanaka took one of those job offers, he would still be allowed to graduate. It was a very generous offer, but Tanaka chose to reject all of those offers in favour of staying at Square, something that not only disappointed his parents, but also brought shame on his professor. Soon after, Tanaka was expelled from university after he stopped paying the tuition fees, but it mattered little, as even though he was still only a part-time employee at Square, he had complete faith in his decision, as it allowed him to do what he loved, making games. And while Sakaguchi was working on Chase Blassty, Tanaka was rewarded for his loyalty by being given the chance to direct a second game, with Genesis being the first. Development on Alpha began in January 1986, while Square was still based in Hiyoshi, and Tanaka was given the task of iterating upon the two Death Trap games by creating a brand new interactive fiction game. Acting as the focal point and visionary, Tanaka took charge of general game design and managing production, and the scenario was penned by Miki Yukimura, who had been involved in both of the Death Trap games. But unlike those two previous games, Alpha would attempt to latch on to the increasing interest in erotic games by featuring a female protagonist called Chris, as well as small amounts of nudity. Shunsagosa continued as one of the programmers, and he was joined by many of Square's other programmers after they had finished up on Chase Blassty. But even though many of these staffers were recruited while Square was still based in Hiyoshi, one crucial hire came after they had relocated to Tokyo, and her name was Kazuko Shibuya. Born on the 4th of September 1965, Shibuya was a keen artist, and while in middle school, she started to create her own cells and custom animations inspired by popular anime series at the time. Such was her talent that she managed to secure part-time work at an animation studio, and during this time she was able to work on some pretty huge projects like Area 88 and the ever-popular Transformers. But even though this should have been the dream job, Shibuya felt restricted. Animation, while being constrained by the rigor of the professional industry, was just not fun, and so she decided to pursue art and graphic design instead. At the time, Square were looking for a graphic designer who had skills with animation, and so Shibuya decided to take the risk, and after landing the job, she was put straight to work on Alpha. Here she worked alongside Sakoto Sugiyama to create a rather distinct graphical style, and when Alpha launched in July of 1986, the game served as a demonstration of how much Square had grown in such a short space of time. Even though it was released only a year after Will the Death Trap 2, Alpha featured a host of detailed bitmap animations. Instead of being restricted to a blink on the title screen, Chris displayed much more expression, and in-game imagery was also animated. And when combined with the special effects and musical score, which was created by Nobuo Uematsu, it created a much more dynamic and engaging experience. Alpha also helped to demonstrate how much Square was continuing to evolve its image. When Will was released, Square had gone to market with a clean and clear branding for the company and its packaging, but upon the release of Alpha, this was upgraded. The packaging was shorter and thinner, and the Squaresoft library numbering was gone. It also included a picture disc vinyl that was much higher quality than the flexi-disc vinyl that was released alongside Blasty, but perhaps the most important milestone was the unveiling of a new company logo. Each of these elements showed that effort was being placed to build Square's reputation, and even though the software being produced by Sakaguchi and Tanaka was important, the work being done behind the scenes by Miyamoto and Suzuki was also crucial. The new logo and image were prominent examples of their work, but to ensure they were continuing to learn, the team took frequent trips to the United States, specifically to Silicon Valley, so that they could spend time with senior figures at Electronic Arts and Broderbund like Doug Carlston. Carlston had co-founded Broderbund with his brother in 1980, and they had published some huge games like Lode Runner and ports of the famous Star Wars arcade game. They had also developed some close ties with Japan throughout the early 1980s and worked with Japanese developers like StarCraft to release games like Apple Galaxian, also known as Alien Reign. As such, Broderbund had fostered relationships with a huge network of developers and partners across the world, and one of them was a rockstar programmer called Nasir Gebeli, who after seeking a new challenge, was introduced to Square. That such a connection existed showed just how far Square had come. In 3 short years, Miyamoto had managed to realize his initial dream, as despite knowing next to nothing about programming himself, a self-sustaining subdivision of his father's company had been created, and they could make video games with a high degree of competency. This had all been achieved without relying on the genius of isolated individuals who could do it all. Instead, Miyamoto had been pragmatic, empowering key individuals like Hironobu Sakaguchi and Hiromichi Tanaka to find creative ways to solve the problems they may face, even if it meant hiring people to fill the gaps. This approach saw Square utilize a variety of programmers, writers and artists, but even though there was significant turnover, a core body of staff started to form. And with Suzuki, Sakaguchi, Tanaka, Aoki, Uematsu and Shibuya now all having a connection with Square, even though the company was still a subdivision of Denusha, Miyamoto pushed his employees to reach for the stars. And reach for the stars they would, as they sought to capitalize on the riches promised by creating software at a rapid pace for the Famicom and its brand new peripheral, the Famicom Disk System. And in the next part of this epic tale, we will show what this meant for a company that was still very much in its infancy, and explore, in significant detail, the events that led up to the creation of a game that would have a profound impact on the entire video game industry for decades to come: Final Fantasy. Before closing this video out, I'd like to give a few shoutouts to people who helped with the construction of it. First, there's Travis, who used his experience with producing documentaries as an editor to make everything look and flow as well as it does. I'd also like to give thanks to Chris Kohler, who after I reached out, was generous enough to offer guidance and to make sure everything was as factually correct as it could be. I'd also like to thank the amazing community. You have all been so supportive and patient throughout this project, and I hope what you've just watched delivered on your expectations and the faith that you placed in us. If you guys like this video and would like to see more content like this, then please consider subscribing and checking out our Patreon. There's a link in the description down below. And I'd like to thank Raining Eckham, Logan Nijay, Benjamin Snow and Gregory for being super special Onion Knight supporters. Alright guys, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.